Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week from Washington, D.C., Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who is the China reporter at Axios. Bethany, great to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
And from Brooklyn, New York City, Peter Spiegel, who is the U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to have you.
Good to be Brooklyn in the house. Yes, absolutely.
And Giles Whittell, who is in London, Giles is the world affairs editor of Tortoise Media. Giles, great to have you as well. A lot of things to talk about. We want to talk about the week of diplomacy between Russia, the United States, and European states. We want to talk about Kazakhstan and about the big year that Xi Jinping and China are facing in 2022. But let's start with sort of the big news of the week, Giles. Russia had a series of diplomatic meetings bilaterally with the United States, then with NATO, and finally with 56 of its closest friends in Europe and North America at the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. What did we learn about what the Russians want and where the state of play is a week after diplomacy? How would you describe the week, and where do you think we're heading?
It's been a tense week, so much so that when we were swapping emails yesterday, I said, looking forward to see you tomorrow, World War III permitting. And Peter, as you'll recall, said, we reckon that that's scheduled for next Tuesday, so we should be okay. Making light of what I said last time I was on the show is a very real threat of a serious military conflagration in the middle of Europe for the first time in many decades. I mean, it may not be that bad. New York Times reported at the beginning of the week that in fact, the exponential or fast troop buildup that US officials expected a month, 6 weeks ago hasn't fully materialized. And so they posited the idea that there might be something less conventional instead. Sure enough, today, a big cyber attack on Ukrainian government offices, most plausibly attributed, although not confirmed yet, to Russian sources. And in the meantime, to answer your question about how the week has gone, it has ended in deadlock. So on the one hand, NATO and the US delegation led by Wendy Sherman have not budged on the principle that no third party like Russia has a veto on NATO membership. It retained its open door policy in principle, including Ukraine, although Ukraine's not on the glide slope to membership right now. On the other hand, Russia hasn't budged on its demands, which were seen in the West as non-starters from the start, that NATO never be allowed membership, that offensive weapons not be placed in NATO members that have joined the alliance in recent years. So where do we go from here? The military buildup is so big, and Putin's form is such that one has to assume that there will be some kind of incursion. It just depends what kind. It might end up no more physical than today's cyber attack. But on the other hand, we have to bear in mind that a cyber attack in Georgia in 2008 and in Crimea in 2014 preceded actual military interventions. Putin has shown that he's not that afeared of economic sanctions, which is essentially what has been threatened in reply. And he knows that even despite this week's conversations, were he to launch a military cross-border attack, one thing that is not going to happen is a NATO-style collective military response because Ukraine is not a member. So we ended the week, or in the middle of the week, when the NATO talks happened in Brussels. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, said there is a real risk of a new armed conflict in Europe. I think it's worth just noting a couple of other things in conclusion. Russia knows that Western Europe is distracted. I'm talking to you from London, whereas ever we're distracted monumentally with parties and with Prince Andrew. Germany is distracted by its own gas supplies, which not incidentally mostly come from Russia, by their new leader, by COVID. France equally by spiking COVID and forthcoming elections. The other thing that I think, the sort of contextual piece that we have to remember is that the crisis is manufactured. The threat that Putin and his staff speak of from NATO is illusory. They have used phrases this week like in connection with Ukraine, that it is being turned, I may have the exact translation wrong, but into an attack weapon, weaponizing Ukraine as an offensive state. It's simply not true. And this is a Michael McFaul point. We have to remember that the threat is illusory. Nonetheless, it is widely believed within Russia by Putin's domestic audience, largely as a result of pro-Kremlin propaganda within the Russian Federation. And there are people who are saying that that an important part of any Western response now has to be a counter-propaganda campaign. So I'd sort of close by asking a question: what should that look like if we are mercifully going to be spared a full military conflict in Europe? What's the information war going to look like after this? Is it a plausible strategy to try to counter Russian propaganda in Russia? I don't know, and I don't know what it looked like, but I think it's an interesting question.
Giles, before we address that, can I just ask you to go back, because as you pointed out at the end of your remarks there, it is a manufactured crisis, because nothing that they have said about the West in general, or NATO more specifically, is true. So I guess it always begs the question of what actually are Putin's aims here. I mean, if we assume that it's increasingly likely after today's events that the attack, or quote unquote, is actually more cyber than physical, why is he manufacturing this? I mean, you touched on a couple things, which is potential reasons for doing this. One is, as you mentioned, sort of destabilizing the West is always a good thing for him. So if we can further divide the Americans from the Europeans and the Europeans from themselves. You also mentioned sort of rallying domestic, because there's been another round of Navalny stuff recently, and then there's Belarus, I guess, where you have, some of the former republics are restive, so he wants to send a message. But it just I can't quite put my finger on it, and it's obviously unknowable. I just wonder what you think. Why is he creating this crisis now, if the things they are saying are so obviously untrue in terms of NATO and Ukrainian intentions? Because as you said, NATO is not about to say Ukraine can't join, but they're not about to join, and Georgia's not either. So it's just sort of, it is just sort of boggles the mind slightly about what Putin actually is trying to do here.
Yeah, we asked the question because it's hard to answer. And the sort of rationalist Western position is there must be something sort of Metternician in his outlook. But perhaps there isn't. Perhaps the way to think this through is to think of him as an enormously successful Russian leader seeking after 20 years to cement his legacy. And one way of doing that would be to turn instability in the former Soviet near abroad into a revived Soviet sphere of influence, and where there isn't already instability, create it so that you can do that. I mean, I think that highly irrational component has to be in part of any explanation for his motives.
It is though, I think, as both of you are saying, the strategy and the aims, there's a mismatch here. It doesn't quite add up, and there is, I think, this fundamental question is, what does Putin want? Seems to be still unanswered by a week of diplomacy, in particular since the demands he's putting on NATO, he knows he's not going to get. And I would argue, even if he gets it, what does it achieve? Right. So NATO, Ukraine is not part of NATO. What does that actually mean for the stability of the region? I want to get Bethany in here as well. You've been an observer of this part of the world for a long time, but I'm also interested in another player who's looking at this. This is Beijing getting ready for the Olympics. We'll actually have a meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping early in February. And sees Europe and increasingly the United States focused on on this part of the world. How do you think Beijing is reading both? How do they read Putin, and what does it do for them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I've seen some people speculating that Putin and Xi are coordinating on this, that this is something that, Putin is actively, engaging in consultations with Xi Jinping so that as the West gets distracted, Xi Jinping can invade Taiwan, China can invade Taiwan. I really don't think that's happening. At the very least, you can most definitely say that, China's leaders are thrilled with the West becoming embroiled in conflicts, potential conflicts with Russia, a concern about the, perhaps a fracturing of NATO or a stress on NATO, this kind of thing. That's great, for China's rise. That's great for Xi Jinping. They had that for 15 years with the US war on terror. And, right now, as Europe and as NATO, in fact, is now for the first time really beginning to turn towards China to say, we really think China is a major concern here. And it's not just NATO and it's not just EU level, it's individual, intelligence agencies in different countries, France, the Netherlands, Estonia, you have what's going on with, Lithuania, the Czech Republic. It's great for Xi Jinping to have something to distract, Europe. Regarding the Russia and China and some kind of axis there, I see it get kind of, I would say, you can have a different interpretation of how closely they're working together generally on strategic goals. It is most certainly the case that they share a lot of overarching goals, and that is finding a strong place for non-Western revisionist powers, creating a strong foothold. They do it in different ways, of course. I think that the potential for conflict between Russia and China, there have been decades of distrust. I think right now that is being slightly overplayed. I think that they have worked, they used for decades, they had running territorial disputes. They've worked through all of those. They seem to have basically delegated, I don't want to say, into different spheres of influence in Central Asia, but they seem to be coordinating there very easily. China does not seem concerned at all about, Russia's recent deployment of troops into Kazakhstan. They seem to be coordinating well, if not working together. So I would just generally say that they are supporting each other's goals and working more and more closely as they're doing that without forming any kind of actual axis.
The other thing I would say, just in terms of what links the two, is the challenge to Biden, right? Because I think in both places, what both of them are testing, particularly in a post-Trump U.S. foreign policy, are the red lines the U.S. has established time immemorial actually red lines, right? Taiwan will not be touched. Well, really? Let's test this. Is the U.S. really ready to go to war with a nuclear power over an island, Taiwan? NATO is invaluable. That is a red line. This is, Article 5 stands Article 5. Oh, really? Let's test this a little bit. What is actually your red line here? And I think particularly post-Trump and post-Afghanistan pullout, I think both China and Russia are going to challenge Biden on, are you really willing to go to war with first world powers or first world militaries over these small regional conflicts, these small regional red lines, which have been established again, basically since the end of World War II. And I think what the signal we're getting from Biden thus far, I got to say, is a little bit disheartening. I think most of the noise we're getting is on Taiwan. I'm not sure we want to go to war with China over Taiwan. And I think similarly, I've been disappointed anyway on the response to Kazakhstan, to Belarus, and to Ukraine, in that they seem to be willing to negotiate with the Russians over what is supposed to be settled history. Now, as Giles said, they have said there are certain things that are non-negotiable, but you're still engaging with the Russians on whether the former Soviet sphere is allowed to join NATO, which was supposed to not be part of the things you talked to the Russians about.
Can I just dive in very briefly, turning the tables, Ivo, because this is your old stomping ground. I'm sorry to ask a question here, but if you are at NATO, just looking at the moment at the western end of the Eurasian continent, and there's 100,000 troop Russian buildup on the other side of Ukraine, and you do not have Article 5 forcing your hand, but nor do you obviously have anything more than incremental economic sanctions. But at the same time, as an alliance, you have a responsibility to preserve security in the Western Hemisphere. What have you got, and how do you avoid panicking?
I mean, I think in that sense, I slightly disagree with Peter in terms of how Biden has responded. If you think there's three things that are the non-negotiable demands that Putin has put on the table. Ukraine cannot be part of NATO, and in fact, there can be no further NATO enlargement, period. Secondly, there can be no offensive weapons on the former Soviet states that used to be part of the former Soviet Union. And third, NATO needs to take all the military capabilities that were deployed into the new members after 1997 out. If he in fact attacks Ukraine, all three of those are going to be less likely, which is to say Ukraine is going to be more inclined to be aligned with the West, at least the part that's still under the control of the Ukrainian government. In fact, 2014 didn't work out in the way he thought it would work out. There was always a big debate in Ukraine about whether or not to join NATO, and popular sentiment for joining NATO was small until he invaded and then annexed Crimea. If he continues to do that, more people will want to join NATO. You will have significantly more military equipment moving forward, including in Eastern Europe, including in the Baltic states, which of course already have capabilities that he would deem offensive, whether it's airplanes or artillery, et cetera, to defend those countries. And just more, and you will have a more unified NATO. I mean, NATO is pretty darn unified right now on this one issue. So if he's trying to break up NATO, prevent NATO from entering the former Soviet sphere, and move back to the old Western Europe, it's not working for him in that sense, and sort of it raises the question of what he's trying to do. Once again, I think the mismatch. If you want NATO to move, why are you going after Ukraine, which is not a NATO member? If you really wanted NATO to do something and challenge it, you'd go to the Baltic states and see whether the Article 5 would stand up. So I think there is a test of will. I think Peter's right. There is a Biden test of will, and it's being played out. And the reality is it's not only the United States has to worry about a great power war with nuclear powers. It's also China and the and Russia would have to worry about a great power war with the United States, which is why I think while he'll move into Ukraine, my sense is I think this scenario of sort of we're on our back foots and Taiwan's already given up, and I'm not there yet. I think there's plenty of things we can still do.
I hope you're right, Ivo. I hope you're right. I mean, you know better than I just remember my time in Brussels, because even though I was just a reporter, but because I had an American accent, whenever you would run into Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian diplomats or officials, they would hear the American accent and they would always ask me, will the Americans really show up? Are they really going to show up? Does Article 5 really mean something? They are perpetually, the polls as well, they're perpetually concerned that the paper Article 5 is not going to be lived up to. And when you see Biden, I think, not invite Zelensky to the White House before having his summit with Putin, when you see, them not meeting with Tikhanovskaya until very late in the presidency, the rhetoric he had going in, which we are the president, going to be the administration that brings, democracy back to the center of foreign policy, has not, I would argue, been matched by actions. They are much more willing to engage with Putin after he does bad things than proactively support pro-Western elements in the former Soviet sphere. And I think that the Baltics hear that, and the Poles hear that, and I worry they haven't been assertive enough on those.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I point out that similar fears were part and parcel of NATO alliance for the last 70 years. The Germans were worried about the United States not defending Berlin, and it's sort of there's inherent in an alliance, particularly when the strongest guarantor of security lives an ocean away. There's an inherent doubt about whether they will come forward. We'll be back on this issue, I'm sure, many times, but let me shift, and I actually think it's aligned in part of it, Peter, to what has happened in Kazakhstan over the last 4 or 5 or 6 days, actually a week plus now. And I'd like to get sort of 2 senses of you. One is sort of what's happening in Kazakhstan, because I think that's in and of itself an interesting debate. And then, this remarkable thing that as we had 100,000 troops, Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, all of a sudden Russian troops are in Kazakhstan at the invitation of the government, as part of this CSTO, NATO-like organization, as it's usually referred to. It's not really NATO-like because it's a Russian-owned, operated subsidiary of the Russian military. But what happened in Kazakhstan, and how should we look at it from the Russian relation to the former Soviet space?
Well, let me address that second part second, because it does get to exactly what Giles was saying before, which is Putin does clearly have Soviet dreams, for lack of a better word, which is there a way to recombine the former Soviet republics, as the former near abroad, into something? And what we've seen in Kazakhstan over the last 2 weeks is actually they may not like this very much, and we've seen that in Belarus as well. But let me get to what is actually happening in Kazakhstan, because I think it is one of those countries that I think we tend to, perhaps as the American public in general, but even as policymakers, ignore. But it's a really important, particularly for financial times, natural resources, oil and gas, uranium. I mean, it is central to the global economy, and it was in some ways seen as a model post-Soviet state autocracy because it was relatively economically successful. And although Nazarbayev was a kleptocrat in an old-fashioned sense, there was a relative peace and a willingness to go along with Nazarbayev's lead, much like Putin, because other things were good. Now, what we saw was Nazarbayev was trying to do a bit of a, it doesn't really work very well, but some sort of peaceful handover to his successor, President Tokayev. Sort of a bit of a great diplomat who had been close to Nazarbayev for a long time. Seemed to go relatively quietly. He assumed the role of this National Security Council head. Nazarbayev did, so still had control of the place. And then suddenly, almost out of nowhere, and I think everyone I've talked to who has worked in this space, particularly on at least on the Western side, it's very, very difficult to report from within Kazakhstan to figure out exactly what's going on. But those who watch the region tell me this is just out of nowhere. A little town where you had some protests over the rising fuel prices becomes a national movement. And initially, just a traditional people grumpy at the state of living in an authoritarian state, but it has become something very different, I think, over the course of the last week, which is clearly a battle within Kazakhstan over control, where Nazarbayev's family, who has become incredibly wealthy and in many ways looted the state, is being actually effectively pushed out by his hand-pointed successor. And so what was originally sort of almost a cover revolution-like movement has become an internal fight for power, with Nazarbayev apparently losing. So that is what is most interesting, and a message for other post-Soviet dictators like Lukashenko in Belarus. I think it's a really compelling story, and I encourage the audience to delve more into it. But I do think from a geopolitical point of view, what it says about the post-Soviet space is actually more important for U.S. foreign policy aims, and also for what is happening in Ukraine and Belarus, which is clearly, if we, as Giles said, it's hard to figure out what exactly Putin's aims are. But one of his aims, because he said it publicly, is he sees the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of the greatest tragedies of modern history, and has been trying to reconstruct it in some ways. We saw it fail in Ukraine, right? There was an attempt to sort of to boost pro-Russian elements in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians rejected it, and they had to send the little green men in. We saw he was more effective in Belarus, but this again, Belarus, like Ukraine, was seen as almost part of Russia, and Lukashenko almost lost his grip on it, and without strong Russian backing, would not have held his grip on Belarus. And now we see his grip on Kazakhstan also apparently slipping, because Nazarbayev, who was very, very Putin-like in his control, almost basically lost his place as well. So I guess the question is whether Putin emerges from this stronger or weaker. I mean, we had this debate last time I was on with Bethany about, when you see people acting in autocratic ways, it's not always from a position of strength, and sometimes it's from a position of weakness. And I would argue some of Putin's bellicosity and aggressiveness in Ukraine comes from a position of weakness. He sees what happened in Belarus, that suddenly his ally, his fellow strongman, was almost toppled by a color revolution. Let me send a message to the Ukrainians and anyone else who's thinking about this, that I might want to send in 100,000 Russian troops. And then suddenly from behind, the Kazakhs have stabbed him in the back. So I think we sometimes see Putin as this master tactician who has this strong grip on his not only domestically, but about some of these former Soviet spaces, when actually he may actually be very weak. You see Navalny challenging him with some popularity at home. You've seen what's happened in Belarus, and now you've seen what's in Kazakhstan. Sometimes I think the West underplays or underappreciates the strong hand it has. And I think in this case, what we've seen in Kazakhstan is a sign that actually maybe Putin's hand is not as strong as we thought it was even a week or two ago when he was amassing 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border and seemed to have us in a corner. And I think that's worth keeping attention on Kazakhstan for that very reason.
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating story of multiple, color revolutions and then power struggles and Putin trying to, I guess, restore order, which he did, but also to sort of decide on whose side of the power struggle he's going to be at, and we'll see this play out. I don't think this is the end of it yet, even though Russian troops are withdrawing from Kazakhstan. There's another player, Bethany, that really has focused on the stance on Central Asia, really wanted to create a sphere of influence, if you want to call it that, in this part of the world. And of course, it's China that is just as interested in oil and uranium and the resources that Kazakhstan has as everybody else. And yet, in the reporting, at least in the Western press, the focus has been on Russia, Kazakhstan, maybe what the U.S. Is doing. Very little on what the Chinese are thinking and perhaps even doing, because they too have a good relationship with Kazakhstan. So how? Tell us what you see in the Chinese commentariat about this and how how Beijing is looking at this.
Sure. Well, when I first heard this news, I immediately became laser focused on this because Kazakhstan is key for certain specific Chinese goals and even security goals. We think about their relationship with Central Asia as being primarily economic, but increasingly that is not true. There are a growing number of security and geopolitical goals as well. And with Kazakhstan in particular, one of those is what China would call counterterrorism, but what is more accurately called, a total crushing of Uyghur and Kazakh people in Xinjiang. And Kazakhstan has been a wonderful partner to China in this, sending back Uyghurs who have fled. Although, Kazakhstan does keep Kazakh citizens who have escaped escaped Xinjiang and left camps. Kazakhstan's partnership with China has been a major obstacle to international reporting on what's on the genocide in Xinjiang, and has been just a very important partner in that. And I think that the Chinese government relies on the Kazakhstan government for that support. So just from that single perspective, and we really should not underestimate the importance of this goal for the Chinese government. So when I saw, that initially these protests looked like they were, some part of them were hoping for a better government that was more responsive to the needs of the people. That is something the Chinese government is going to be deeply opposed to and allergic to in some ways, right? And even though it has devolved into kind of a power struggle, this is something the Chinese government does not want. So what I was expecting, and what indeed did happen, was the Chinese government to get involved in some way, probably a subtle way, definitely not a military way, to try to do the playbook that it has found so very useful and productive on its own soil in Hong Kong. And that's what we saw. So Wang Yi, the foreign minister, came out with a big statement saying that they oppose, I think they called it external forces in Kazakhstan. And they were not talking about the Russians. They were basically accusing the US, this is a kind of dog whistle, right? Accusing the US of fomenting this grassroots opposition to the government, which is exactly what they did in Hong Kong. Very successful. This is the kind of disinformation that plays really well among, in a certain kind of non-Western online space against people who are pretty anti-American anyway. And that kind of language, that kind of playbook is something that we're increasingly seeing China exporting in a certain kind of way, not along ideological, communist lines like we saw during the Cold War, but simply to support authoritarian governments that are closely aligned to China, because China works the best with authoritarian governments. And in Kazakhstan, for example, it is deeply unpopular in Kazakhstan that the Kazakhstan government is not helping Kazakhs and Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Kazakhs want that, but the Kazakhstan government does not support that. And so this would be a nightmare situation for some kind of government in Kazakhstan to be more responsive to the needs and desires of the Kazakh people. And China is not particularly supportive of anti-corruption in any country except for itself, because it works very well through corruption of leaders. It loves to participate in that. Kazakhstan's an important stop along the Belt and Road initiative, which relies a lot on corruption, but giving these fancy projects to authoritarian leaders so they have something fancy to show. Kazakhstan's really into that. Also, if there were to be sustained unrest along the Kazakhstan-Xinjiang border, that would create chaos. That's something the Chinese government also really doesn't want. So I was not surprised to see that we saw these high-level comments from the Chinese government, and I would strongly suspect, this is speculation, that there are lots of phone calls and offers of other kinds of tacit support, although not military support, from Beijing.
Bethany, can I ask you just to look at that from a Washington perspective? Because given what you just said, that it is not in Chinese interest to have unrest in Kazakhstan, you would think it then would be conversely in U.S. interest for something new to happen in Kazakhstan. And yet the Biden administration has been, yet again, I would argue, almost absent. They put out a rather dull, statement early in the crisis, saying, please stop being bad to each other, but show no support for democracy or human rights within Kazakhstan. And I'm just sort of wonder if you could look at the Chinese element and how Biden has reacted to Kazakhstan in that light.
That's not surprising to me at all. I mean, I think, if you're viewing the world from Beijing, a lot of its major initiatives and its major partners are in areas that the US has given up on, never put that much interest into, and continues not to. So, throughout the continent of Africa, even in South American countries where the US has just doesn't really get involved anymore. Central Asia is a big one, enormous, sustained lack of interest and lack of support from the US government. It was back around, I don't remember, gosh, I'm going to get this wrong. I don't think it was Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. I think it was before that. Maybe, let's say 12 to 14 years ago, 8 to 12 years ago, in the US, there was a proposal to actually have a new Silk Road going across Central Asia. Never happened. China thought it was a great idea and took the very same branding and did it. So it is not shocking to me at all that there is very little US involvement. This is classic. This is what has enabled China's rise. It's what so many people in Washington who follow China closely are urging. They urge the Trump administration to do. They urge, the Biden administration. They were urging Obama to do, and it just largely falls on deaf ears. And we can get into a long discussion of why. We're starting to see a little bit more activity, in some African nations, regarding, for example, a proposed Chinese base in, Guinea, one of these countries. But it doesn't surprise me at all, and I think it's, we can get into the reasons why.
Yeah, no. Bethany, I think it's fascinating. It really is, and sort of this vacuum that was created. I'm also struck by the analysis you have that there's a complete alignment between Russia and China in terms of the nature of the system. And Giles, I want to get to you on this, because one of the questions I've been asking, the strange thing, you have a popular uprising that gets hijacked, right, by thugs. And it become, you have these reports of people are protesting. All of a sudden, folks are showing up with knives and clubs and everything else. And I've been wondering where these people come from. And the speculation in the press has been, it's the current regime trying to oust the former regime. There's another obvious explanation, right? Which is that it gets vomited from Moscow. That these are just the new little green men, because you get these people, there's unrest, and 2 days later, Russian troops are inside Kazakhstan. I don't know, but there is an alignment here of interest, it seems to me, between Beijing, between Moscow, and whatever authoritarian group of leaders in Kazakhstan want to have control. And it strikes me that we just don't have a lot of say over there anymore. The West writ large. I haven't heard a European Union statement or a complaint from Borrell that he wasn't invited to Kazakhstan. So I haven't seen a lot there. Giles, how do you see it?
No question about that alignment at a top political level and strategic, whether or not the thugs were flown in ahead of the uniformed guys. What they did was extremely effective. You can't help but note in news reports gunshots to the head of most of those who are dead on the streets of Almaty. One note on that, to the extent that the Nazarbayev model might have been intended as a template for a Putin eventual retirement, this has backfired on Nazarbayev, and it would seem implausible that the Kremlin would send in thugs to help Tokayev in this particular, what does seem to have been eventually a clash of the clans, as it were. One thing that I wanted to add to the discussion about this high-level alignment, and we've spoken about what appears to be de facto cooperation, kind of natural cooperation between authoritarian regimes in Moscow and Beijing. But Bethany mentioned Belt and Road. And on my two most recent visits, which alas are not that recent, to Central Asia and Moscow respectively, I had really memorable reminders that without branding it as such, Russia has been building stuff busily in former Soviet Central Asia as well. For example, metalled roads all the way from Moscow to Almaty, all the way from Moscow to Bishkek. Your taxi drivers in Moscow, they can now drive home in 3 days. That was unheard of when I first went to that region. You drive through Kyrgyzstan, gleaming new power substations, getting hydropower out of the mountains onto the steppe and into southern Siberia. So my question is, this cooperation, if it's tested, isn't Central Asia going to become sooner or later a zone of competition between Russia and China?
Bethany, I'm going to, I don't know if you want to answer it, because I do think it's an incredibly interesting and important question. I don't know whether we have the answer to it, but it's something to behold on it. So I'll give you the opportunity to answer it, but also want to switch over and start talking about, because we only have about 10 minutes or so left, about Xi Jinping's sort of 2020 year. I was thought of Putin may have, as Giles said, may have learned that retiring is not such a good idea. Xi Jinping doesn't seem to be one to retire. He's supposed to do that at the end of this year. But he too is maybe reading this lesson that when you're an autocrat and you're retiring, it's not clear that your retirement will be peaceful or easy. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. So on the question of Central Asia, I mean, it would be an enormous strategic mistake for Russia and China to allow their sort of, alignment or cooperation in Central Asia to become fraught with tension, especially because they have had to work through it rather carefully. I think what we're seeing right now, so you can say short to medium term, is that both Russia and China have smelled blood in the West. There's weakness here, and I think that they both see not only that this is an opportunity, but that there's a sense of momentum that they can see when they're both working on things together, that it strengthens both of their goals. And it would be very foolish to allow whatever concern in Central Asia, whether it's over resources or over turf, to get in the way of that. And it's hard to think of a good enough reason. What is there really to fight over? So maybe in the long run, who knows? But in the short to medium term, I would be very surprised if it becomes a source of tension between Moscow and Beijing. On 2022, in terms of Xi Jinping, it being a big year for him, boy, it really is. And it's starting off with some major challenges. And the first one I'll go into is the China's no COVID strategy, which in the second half of 2020 and last year, 2021, looked pretty great. And I think it was the subject of quite a bit of global admiration, as you saw only a few countries outside of China able to pull that thing off. You had, Australia, Taiwan, New Zealand come to mind. And I think it resulted in quite a bit of admiration for their system, a kind of begrudging admiration, as in Europe and the US, we just couldn't get our shit together. Things are really different with Omicron.
It's a technical term, by the way.
Technical term. Things are really different with Omicron, and here's why. If we're looking at Omicron and future strains, which may be impeded by vaccination but are not stopped by it, that's a very severe problem. A no COVID strategy only works if you have a clear end goal in mind where your population has herd immunity. And it was pretty clear early on that Chinese-made vaccines, that the first generation of Chinese-made vaccines were not going to grant that herd immunity. And you did not see China then approve Western-made mRNA vaccines for use in China. I'm sure that's for geopolitical reasons. They want to wait for their own mRNA vaccines to be manufactured. Okay, that's fine. The rest of the world is still in COVID chaos. You want to keep your no COVID strategy going for a while longer, that's fine. But now with Omicron, we're seeing that even mRNA vaccines are not stopping the spread. Now, I think Xi Jinping is seeing what really lies ahead for China. And at some point, it seems inevitable at this point, there is going to be a really hard dismount for China. They cannot keep this up forever. Because of the success of their no COVID strategy, they have a very low level of natural immunity. Almost all immunity in China comes from vaccines, and relatively ineffective vaccines at that. As Omicron is so contagious, what we're seeing now is more and more and more extreme measures to contain its spread. And in Xi'an right now, I think they're going into their 4th week of a very severe lockdown, kind of equivalent to what we saw in Wuhan in the beginning of 2020. And if they're really serious about this, they're going to have to keep doing that. And we're seeing some really terrible things coming out of it. A pregnant woman, 8 months pregnant, bleeding, was denied entry to a hospital because she didn't have the right paperwork to show that she was, her test was negative. Her baby died. There was a man who was having a heart attack, same problem. He died. People not getting enough food. So this is what 2022 is going to continue to be like for China. And I think what's going to happen from people looking on is that begrudging admiration is going to start to turn to a little bit of pity that they're having to go through this, and as the gap between what China has, which is low immunity, no COVID, and what they're going to have at some point, inevitably, which is high immunity, which means lots of COVID. When you have, a population of 1.4 billion, and COVID spreads through it, which is inevitable, that's going to happen, that's going to be a very bad news cycle, unless the alternative is to keep China closed for the next 10 years. So it's really, this is a very difficult balancing act that Xi Jinping is going to have to pull off, and I don't know how it's going to end for him. An exacerbating factor right now is the Olympics. It's very important for China's image that it has a COVID-free Olympics, that it can carry out these games with no problem. And so as they're trying to crack down on just, a few cases of Omicron here and there, we're seeing more lockdowns, more stress. So lots of stress there. I think they can. I think they will have a COVID-free Olympics, but it's just a huge amount of tension. So the second of the three things I'll highlight is the Olympics. There's been obviously a huge amount of controversy over the ongoing genocide in China. I think what's happened though, because of COVID, is that the diplomatic boycotts have become a little bit of a moot point, because no government wants to host, the Olympics during a pandemic. The level of the soft power boost and the prestige boost that they would have gotten has suffered such a heavy dent from COVID that it's a little bit of a moot point. And then finally, just briefly, I'll talk about the huge thing that's happening at the end of 2020, really an enormous era-defining change, is that Xi Jinping is most certainly going to be named to a 3rd term. And that will bring to the end a system of limited terms for Chinese top leaders that was put into place after the excesses of the Mao era. And it's if you will, it's a kind of autocratic self-check, a kind of check and balance on an autocratic system. It's still an autocratic system, but it prevents any one person from gaining too much power. And Xi Jinping has already consolidated his power enough to be able to sweep that aside. I think in the short run, that will allow him to continue his very successful policies, both domestic and internationally, raising China's power and status in the world. I think in the long run, it's going to be, 20 years from now when he's out of power, like, what's China going to have to deal with? What will be the excesses they have to deal with? I don't think it's a good direction for the Chinese people.
That's a pretty bleak sort of outlook here, Bethany, particularly starting on the COVID side, but also, the reemergence of the cult of personality, which we've already seen in the last few years, but sort of pinpointed by abandoning the transfer of leadership. And we know from history that cults of personality are central to both totalitarian systems and to their demise in the end, in one form or another. Peter, pick up one of the, we're out of time, but pick up one of those issues. What strikes you as the one thing to watch that Bethany put on the table?
Well, the one thing I want to ask Bethany was, what we know in party conference years in particular is that you tend to get a freezing of activity because everyone gets in a bit of a panic, and we got to make sure nothing goes wrong because we got the party conference coming. As you said, you add the Olympics to that, you add Omicron to that, you have the makings of a very brittle Chinese state, almost unable to act. Because we've seen this in the past with party conferences. We've seen Xi disappear from the international stage. I'm just curious about your view as to the ability of the Chinese state to act in both domestic and international affairs at a time that clearly everyone is in a bit of a panic that they have to pull off the Olympics and the party conference, which tends to lead Chinese officials to get to a hunker down position.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we haven't seen any, in the past couple of years, let's say, we haven't seen any shortage of Chinese actions, either domestically or internationally. What I think we are seeing is, and in 2022, we'll certainly see more of, is an enormous amount of fears that don't come out in terms of people saying, I'm scared, but comes out in terms of ultra-nationalism and a total crushing of dissent, both inside the party and out. So we're going to see, further crackdowns, lots of silence. Doesn't mean things aren't happening, but lots of silence and an extremely aggressive international pose.
We're going to be watching all of that. A really fascinating year ahead. Not a lot of good news, but then that's what we're getting used to. Bethany, I want to thank you for your insights today. Peter, as well, and Giles, really appreciate you all being with us today. We'll get back to all of these issues next week and the weeks following when we tune in for another session of World Review. In the meantime, thank you all for watching. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Peter, Bethany, Giles. Have a great weekend. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks so much.